Have you ever really thought about that invisible script, that code that connects you to your parents, your grandparents, and every single one of your ancestors? Well, that's the code of life. It's the fundamental principle of inheritance, and it shapes every living thing on this planet. So, how does this invisible script actually work? Let's dive in and unlock the simple, elegant rules that govern this whole incredible process.
It's a question we've all asked, right? You look in the mirror and you see bits and pieces of your family looking back at you. This mix of traits, this family resemblance, it's not just random chance. It actually follows a really precise, surprisingly elegant set of rules.
And, the question of how these traits get passed down has fascinated people for, forever. For the longest time, it was just a giant mystery, a huge puzzle with no clear solution. Today, we're going to piece that puzzle together.
Think about it. For thousands of years, people knew that children looked like their parents. Farmers knew that if they bred their best livestock or used seeds from their best crops, they'd get better offspring. The what was obvious, but the how? That was a complete black box. The actual rules of the game were totally unknown. And then, in the 19th century, this Augustinian friar named Gregor Mendel started to find the answers. And get this, he didn't do it in some fancy high-tech lab. He did it in a simple monastery garden, working with, of all things, pea plants.
Mendel's real genius was in his meticulous method. He took pea plants that were always tall and crossed them with plants that were always dwarf. And the result was, honestly, it was stunning. Every single one of the baby plants, the offspring, was tall. It was like the dwarf trait had just vanished into thin air. But, and this is the kicker, when he then crossed those tall plants with each other, the dwarf trait suddenly popped right back up. It hadn't been lost at all, it was just hiding.
So Mendel figured that these traits had to be controlled by what he called factors that were passed down from parent to offspring. Today, we have a different name for those factors. We call them genes. They are the fundamental units of inheritance, kind of like the individual instruction manuals in the code of life.
Okay, so if a gene is an instruction, let's say for plant height, then alleles are the different versions of that instruction. Think of it like this. For the height gene, there were two alleles in his plants. One for tall, which we write with a capital T because it's dominant, and one for dwarf, which we write with a lowercase t because it's recessive.
And this brings us to a super important distinction: genotype versus phenotype. The genotype is the actual genetic blueprint, the combination of alleles an organism has. The phenotype, on the other hand, is the physical trait we can actually see, like whether the plant is tall or short. And this tells us something critical. An organism's appearance isn't the whole story. You can have totally different genotypes that lead to the exact same phenotype.
Now, this little grid is a Punnett Square, and it's an absolutely brilliant tool for predicting the outcome of a genetic cross. Let's walk through it. We take the two alleles from one parent, a big T and a little t, and put them across the top. Then we do the same for the other parent along the side. By filling in the boxes, we can see all the possible genetic combinations for their offspring: 1 TT, 2 TTs, and 1 TT.
And this shows us exactly what Mendel saw in his garden. Because that tall allele is dominant, both the TT plants and the TT plants are going to be tall. That adds up to 3/4 or 75% of the plants. Only the little TT plants will actually be dwarf, which is the last quarter. And there it is, that classic 3-to-1 ratio that Mendel saw over and over again. It was math in biology. How cool is that?
You see, these consistent, predictable results weren't just a coincidence. They were proof of some fundamental rules at play. And from all this data, Mendel figured out the very laws of inheritance.
The first one is the law of dominance. It's pretty straightforward. It just says that when an organism has two different alleles for a trait, one of them, the dominant one, is the one you see. It completely masks the effect of the other, recessive allele. This is exactly why all of Mendel's first-generation plants were tall, even though they were carrying the dwarf allele.
So that brings up the big question. How did the dwarf trait make a comeback? Well, the law of segregation explains it. It says that when an organism makes its reproductive cells, its gametes, sperm or eggs, the two alleles for each gene literally separate from each other. That means each gamete only carries one of the two possible alleles. This is the engine of diversity, allowing for new combinations in every single new generation.
Now, Mendel's laws are the absolute foundation. But of course, the story gets even more interesting. Sometimes one allele isn't completely dominant. And what we call incomplete dominance, you get a blend, like when a red flower and a white flower make pink offspring. Then there's codominance, where both alleles show up equally.
The perfect example is our own ABO blood group system, where the A and B alleles are both fully expressed if you happen to inherit them both.
Mendel's final law came from looking at two traits at the same time, like seed color and seed shape. What he found was that the inheritance of one trait had absolutely no effect on the inheritance of the other. They sort themselves out independently. It's like a constant shuffling of the genetic deck, and it's incredibly important because it creates a massive amount of variation.
So just think about this. These rules were discovered in pea plants over 150 years ago. But the most amazing part, they apply to us too. So let's jump from Mendel's garden and see how these principles play out in our own, much more complex human code.
One of the most basic inherited traits is, of course, biological sex, and it's determined by specific chromosomes. But it turns out there isn't just one way to do it. While we humans use the familiar XY system, other species have completely different setups. Some insects use an XO system, and birds use a ZW system, where it's actually the female that determines the sex of the offspring.
But back to us humans, we use the XX/XY system. Females have two X chromosomes, so all of their eggs carry a single X. Males have one X and one Y, so their sperm can carry either an X or a Y. And what you get is a simple 50-50 shot. If a sperm with an X fertilizes the egg, the baby is female. If a sperm with a Y gets there first, the baby is male. So ultimately, it's the sperm that determines the biological sex of the child.
But wait a minute. Where do these new alleles even come from in the first place? The answer is mutation. A mutation is just any change in the DNA sequence. And while we often think of them in a negative light, mutations are the ultimate source of all genetic variation. They're the raw material that evolution has to work with.
Now, sometimes these principles of inheritance can lead to genetic disorders. This here is a pedigree chart, which is basically a family tree that geneticists use to track how traits get passed down. What we're seeing here is the pattern for a recessive disorder like sickle cell anemia. And because it's recessive, you need 2 copies of the gene to have the disorder, which is why it can look like it skips a generation.
A lot of human diseases actually follow these simple Mendelian patterns. Conditions like hemophilia, cystic fibrosis, and colorblindness, they're all caused by mutations in a single gene. And we can predict how they're passed down using the exact same rules that Mendel figured out in his garden all those years ago.
So let's just put this in perspective. In a little over a century, we've gone from not even knowing the basic rules of inheritance to mapping the entire human genome. We have learned to read the code of life. But the next great frontier is learning how to write it, how to edit that code. The question is no longer, can we, but should we? And are we ready for the enormous responsibility that comes with that power?